Hello and welcome to Angles and Acid, where we learn things maths and science. And today it's different, isn't it? So this is actually going to be a maths video about a project. It's not a fantastic project, but it's one of my projects that are around the house that I've made. And I know it's leaning over, and I think I know why. But basically, my students are working on doing a maths-based problem-solving report. And it looks so similar to stuff that I do. Like every time there's a holiday break, I'm usually making something. So I thought I'd share with my viewers one of my creations. It's not my best, but one of the creations, and I could sort of demo a little bit of the report that my students are going to be making. So hopefully when you see this, you can then hopefully translate what I'm doing and the sort of process that I'm taking. Hopefully you can then translate that to your own project as you're writing yours. I am going to be following a notebook because I'm doing this rather quickly. So the first thing that my students have to write is an introduction paragraph, and that's going to outline a few things. So your purpose, your main factors that you're investigating, how you conducted this project, and what will you convey in your reports. So the purpose of the video that I'm going to tell you about is about how I went about designing and building this set of shelves here. When I went about making the design, some considerations, the factors that I had to deal with is what kind of shelves, how many shelves, and keeping it all within budget, because I can't afford to spend. I didn't want to spend a lot of money on a set of shelves, to be honest, especially when you consider IKEA, how they're very cost effective for what you get. But I was looking for something very specific to fitting my household tools and as well as my video equipment. So to do this, I looked at the dimensions of some of the items I already owned. I also did some online shopping on Bunnings.com and looked at what kind of materials I could afford, and doing tallies and then creating a budget, and then obviously going out and buying it, and then for building it. So this video is roughly going to teach you or tell you about how I went designing and building this project. The next thing in the report you talk about is your considerations. So in the previous thing that we were working on, we were talking about early ideas and how they did or didn't work, and therefore you arrived at a different idea instead, or you modified it somehow. Some considerations that had to be made about this project are cost. I had to make something that I could afford. I had budgeted for about $200. It ended up being a little bit more expensive though, because steel is more expensive, and when I went to go purchase the pieces, they didn't have the exact pieces I wanted, so I ended up getting longer pieces, therefore more expensive. Another consideration that I had was that it was really important to me that when I'm standing, maybe a meter or so away from the set of shelves, it was really important to me that the shelf above wouldn't block the vision of an item way at the back. So I did a little bit of working out to try and make sure that I could still see way to the back. I didn't want to have things lost in the back of shelves. And another consideration that was important to me was that I could actually, how workable the material is. So I could choose for these shelves to be made out of plywood, which is kind of ugly for me on the edges, so I didn't go with plywood. I could choose pine. It's very cheap, which would have helped with the budget. However, pine is generally quite soft, so if I'm dropping things on it, not really dropping, but I got heavy metal pieces of equipment, and they'll just make dents in it all. So pine wasn't really a feasible choice. I could choose beech, which is what this material is made of. It's got a medium hardness, and it's very well known to be very workable. So if I want to saw it by hand, or if I want to shave the edges with a hand plane, I could do that really easily because the material is very workable, very easy to use. Or I could have chosen something hardwood, which is more like the other option that was available was Victorian ash, or we call it Tasmanian oak at Bunnings, which I think is an ugly color, so I didn't like it for that reason. I could sort of modify the color with a bit of stain, but more expensive. But I generally really don't like working with Victorian ash. It splinters, it's very heavy, and those sort of things, and expensive, more expensive than the other choices. So I decided not to go with Victorian ash, and so I ended up settling for a cheap type of board, assembled of smaller pieces to make this beech shelves. Okay, so how did I go about designing this project? Well, I had to get a few measurements first. One of the main measurements that I had, I don't know if you can see it in the bottom of the frame here, but let me just tilt this down for a moment. My main first measurement that I used to determine how long I wanted it to be was basically this case here, where I wanted to make sure that it was long enough to fit this and at least another bag on the end. So I placed another bag and then determined how long the shelf had to be. For the width at the top here, so let me just re-angle it back up to the top. So to figure out how deep the shelves would have to be, I basically grabbed one of the largest bags I had, placed it on top such that it was facing, this way, and basically take that measurement with a little bit of extra if I could afford it. Then the next measurement I had to determine was how far apart the spacings would be. And one of the methods I did is to find another desk around the house that I had, and I would basically get my tape measure and match it to the dimension that the width of the board would be, and then I would stand next to it and I would basically hold it flush with the rest of the table and lower it, and then I would basically eyeball it. So how far down can I have this tape measure such that I can still see straight down and see the other end of the tape measure. That would then determine approximately how deep the shelf would have to be. So that's how I arrived at those measurements. Then the next part of the process was, if you'll forgive me, I'm doing this quite a rush job here. Let me just bring it. So the next part of the process, I had my length, I had my width, and I had the separation depth for each of those shelves. It then basically came to drawing it up. So here are some of the early measurements. I had initially with these numbers here, so I projected 1600 mil this way, 300 mil deep. I decided that 300 mil is perhaps a little bit too shallow, so that's why you probably saw that over here in purple. I overwrote that and said nah, more 450, which is pretty much exactly what I ended up with. Then I did a little bit of maths by looking at these parts and looking them up onto a website where I could buy materials, and so I went to bunnings.com.au and I looked up basically this beach material and see how much that would cost me. I then also looked at the different lengths of steel pipes and the different pieces. And one of my biggest frustrations going to Bunnings is that you go to Bunnings and you buy a bunch of stuff and you come back and you realize you forgot something because you didn't spend that time in advance planning it out. So for me, to make sure I didn't have that error again, I actually wrote down all the pieces I would need of steel so I could just make myself a little checklist. Then with all that done, so all the pieces of metal, the costs from the website, the scale drawings, I arrived at a predicted cost of $257.72. Plus a few extras. I already had some other materials at home, like I already had a little bit of wax and oil that I could use to bring out the color and have a nicer finish on the surface here. But that's basically what I ended up with the design. However, when it came to actually purchasing the materials, so here I've actually got a copy of the receipt and I'll probably have that on screen, but essentially it cost me $288. And that was mainly because of these extra lengths of PVC, not PVC, steel, which were a little bit longer than I actually had designed for. But hey, if you're trying to build it in a budget and in time, I just decided to go with the longer lengths. Okay, so the crux of the design is that we have a steel pipe that runs through a hole in the timber, and then it's screwed into this coupling. And that provides a bit of a platform because the coupling is a little bit wider than the rest of the tubes. So that rests on here. So as long as I drill the hole and I have this steel pipe running through it, I could then basically use this as a stepping mechanism to hold each of the shelves up. And I thought that it was pretty nice to have a little bit of a handle thing here because it is on casters, so I can sort of like roll it around for when I'm doing my videos. If it's in the way, I'll just wheel it across and it's out of my background. So that's how I made it. Okay, so the receipt that I showed earlier was actually for a different project. I made a table, so I can't seem to find the original receipt, so I went ahead to Bunnings.com and refound most of the parts and created a spreadsheet here. So students, you will also make some spreadsheets, and this is the most handy thing as an adult, because it's basically a calculator that can do simple maths for you on a grand scale. Okay, so I've done some basic formatting here where I've got this is Microsoft Excel, and I've basically typed in some headings here, and then I highlighted them all, and I basically clicked on bold, and then I could use the paint bucket tool and change the color of the background to just give some visual organization here, so that I tend to respond better with colors. That's kind of why I use them. So I went ahead and divided the cost of the project into different categories. So, finishing materials, so tung oil and rags. There's also wax, but I didn't. I already had some lying around, so it wasn't a cost for me. How much wood, the wood costs, the steel cost, and other items. And then underneath those different categories, I then basically did some calculations to find out how much that would cost me. So overall, for finishing materials, it cost me $46.59. For the wood, well, it's only $120, and so on. So I'm going to show you some of the features about Microsoft Excel and why so many people out there use it. Okay, so first thing I'm going to work on is formatting. So you'll notice how in this region of my spreadsheet, the units are nice. So this is 40, and you can see the dollar sign right here. That's really good. So I haven't done that to this section of the spreadsheet yet, so it's incomplete, because I want to take you along for the ride. So basically, the price, well, I've got to make sure all of these values here, I want all of them to be in the unit of percentages. So up here, in this little key up here, I'm going to click on for percent. Oops, sorry, not percentage, for dollar sign. And once I've done that, now it's all formatted to be in dollars. The next thing is I basically said, well, I've got, out of the steel couplings, I had 8 of them. That means it's going to be, the total cost was 8 times the price of each of those couplings, so 8 times that number. I can program Microsoft Excel to calculate this for me. So I'm basically going to select the cell. These are all called cells. I'm going to select the cell that's adjacent to it, and I'm going to hit equals. Now, once I've pressed equals, it's now listening for me for some instructions. So I'm going to give it some instructions. I want it to, and I'm going to click. I want it to take this number that's in this box, and this RC is just for it to reference where it comes from. I want this box times by, now for a computer, and the same thing on a let me just go find it. Just like you have on these sort of calculators, when you hit the times symbol, you'll see that sometimes on certain calculators it doesn't show up as an X, it actually shows up as an asterisk. The same notation shows up on Microsoft Excel. So the asterisk means multiplication. So this cell multiplied by this cell. Once I've got that done, so you'll see it's color coordinated. It's basically this box that I originally selected is equal to the one next to it multiplied by the one over here as well. Once I hit enter, it'll actually do the math. So it's actually multiplied 8 times 2.59. But the brilliant part of Excel is that I mentioned to you, it can do a lot of maths that you've programmed on a grand scale. So I can actually grab, there's a little green handle on the very bottom right corner of this cell. If I grab it, I can pull it down, and it applies the math, the same rule, where this cell is now these two things multiplied together. I'm going to hit escape. And this cell is those two multiplied. So I basically applied the rule all the way down. It saves me from using a calculator, especially if I have a really long list of items. Let's say I'm trying to redecorate the entire house. I could have a really long spreadsheet that can tally things up for me. Now I want to see what the total is of these items all together. So instead of using my calculator like this, I can actually program it to do that too. So I'm going to hit this cell is equal to, I'm going to start giving it a command. So I'm going to type in the command, which is called sum. And I'm using capital letters here. So I put sum, and I put a open bracket, and it's asking me, what do you want to sum together? Well, I want to sum these numbers together. So I clicked, dragged my mouse, and then let go to make my selection. once I've made my selection, I have to close my bracket over here on the screen. So close the bracket, now hit enter, it's done the calculation, it's added all the values above it. So now I have the total finished materials, the total wood materials, and the total steel materials. What was the overall total cost that this project cost me? Well, I've got a little box up here to organize that too. So this cell is equal to, remember I can click on things, so this number, I use the plus sign, plus this number, plus this number, and now I can hit equals, and the total cost was $290.31. So it was pretty close to what I was guessing earlier on the video. Now the cool thing about this is that this is all dynamic, meaning that let's say midway through your project you decided, oh, you know what, I don't want to have as many shelves after all. So that means if I have one less shelf, that means I have one less plank of wood. So instead of having 3 planks, I just need 2 planks, and I hit enter, and that modified this cost, which then modified the total. So okay, that reduced the cost down. Oh yes, but if I don't have 3 shelves, that means I need less couplings. So I don't need 8, I just need to have 4, so that's less. So 4 couplings, that reduces the cost even further, and it carries through everywhere. If I got less couplings, do I take any other savings? Oh yes, I have 4 lengths of the long pipe, so it becomes 4 instead of 8. And now I reduced the total cost of steel, and therefore reduced the overall cost to about $215. This is a great way to dynamically, make a few changes here, and then see how that would affect your total. So if you're trying to work to a budget, this might be a good way of doing it. For me, it was really important to have 3 shelves, so I've just spent the extra. Right, that's basically what you're going to do for your results. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses. Well, basically I'm going to say, what was good about the project design, and what was obviously a problem, I suppose, could have been better, that sort of thing. So for me, strength of the design is I absolutely love the color. So the tung oil really brought out the color and the texture in the timber, and the wax finish was also really nice and smooth. Other things are that the height of the shelves were nice and big, so I actually can fit things in here a lot bigger than I had originally designed. So even though this ended up being a bit bigger than my original design, it ends up being a nice height up here, but also enough space for a lot of things. The casters, being able to freely move it in and around when I need to is super helpful. Limitations, obviously the thing is a bit lopsided, so it's not exactly rigid, and I think I figured out why. It's because the thickness of each of the shelves has to give some decent surface area contact on each of these pipes. So because this is a narrow, that's very a small amount of surface area actually making contact with the pipe, so it can actually jostle around a little bit more than it was intended to do. So next time if I was to make this, I would probably choose something that's a bit thicker. Also, limitations, I found it very difficult to drill through the material by hand, so just the equipment that I owned wasn't up to the task, so I was trying to get away with other methods too, which ended up affecting the quality of the holes that I made. But besides that, it's good height, it works, it rolls around, I can lock it with my feet on the casters, and it does the job really nicely. Okay, and the last thing to this video is just conclusion. So I know this has been really rough. I had a microphone, but it started going crazy, so the sound's going to be terrible, I know, but it's Sunday night, and I don't have time to do another reshoot, sorry. Conclusion, you're basically going to revise to the reader of your report. You're going to remind them what your purpose was, basically summarizing, what you learned through this process and what you ended up with, how it could be improved, and basically concluding a concluding statement of what you have conveyed. So for me in this video, it's kind of like a report. The purpose was to design a set of shelves that was going to fit my equipment, be cheap enough that I can afford it and to be mobile, and also large enough spacing so that I can maximize visually where everything is. The summary is that I did measurements around the house. I then did sketches. I then investigated on the web to find materials and then basically add up the costs. Then when it came to construction, I basically found that there were complications with drilling the holes right through the timber, especially doing it by hand with not the right kind of drill bit. And the material ended up being a little bit too thin, which means that there is a bit more play when the pipe is going through it. But it worked really well in other ways. So this video, we basically talked about the design of this project. I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. I hope it's not too long. But I did want to give you a bit of a demo when you are going to try your own project. And once again, I do apologize profusely for if the sound quality is not that great, because my microphone up there is relatively far away in some of the clips and pretty close now, where I realized that my actual internal microphone here stopped working properly. So I will catch you guys next video. All right, thanks, bye.